If you're anything like me, then you have spent an exorbitant amount of time thinking and talking about the stories of the Sonic the Hedgehog video games for some reason, but we've all talked about the stories that got into the Sonic games plenty. What about the stories that didn't make it into the Sonic games? The stories that they were considering and thinking about implementing, but ultimately decided not to. Naturally, pretty much every game has a lot of content that has to get cut from it, but that's not what we're going to be talking about in this video. I want to specifically talk about the story-based elements that have been removed or cut or changed during the development process of various Sonic games. To be clear, I'm not going to be talking about absolutely everything, as there's way too much to cover it all, but also, a lot of it's not really that super interesting, because it's kind of just the development of the creative process. You have ideas, and then you decide not to go with them, and you change things around. It's just what happens. Not every single tiny little insignificant detail that could have ended up in a Sonic game is necessarily worth talking about or very interesting. I'm just going to be honing in on the stuff that actually does have some interesting stuff to discuss. For example, starting off at the very beginning, we have the character of Sonic himself. Everybody knows that Sonic went through a very long process of developing his character into what we know today, and they considered many different possible characters before they landed on the super fast blue hedgehog. And a lot of these things are the exact kind of stuff I'm talking about, where it's not really that interesting me to talk about Sonic's many different iterations and concept sketches and stuff that they had going on, because, they were just trying stuff and seeing what would work. However, there is one particular potential idea they had for Sonic that I do think is worth touching on, which is this one here, this rabbit character, as this design has a little bit more to it than just some random rough sketches of what could potentially be the playable character of the video game that they were working on at the time. Apparently, the idea with this character was that he was going to use his ears and he would stretch them out in order to grab onto objects, and that would be kind of a core element of the gameplay. Ultimately, Sonic Team decided not to go with that, instead go with a hedgehog and rolling in the ball and all that. But the idea for this character of someone that can stretch out their limbs to grab and manipulate stuff, that ended up eventually getting realized into a game in the form of Rystar, or Bristar, however you pronounce it. While Rystar wasn't developed by Sonic Team, the idea here is very similar to what they had for that potential rabbit version of Sonic, and I do believe that is where the idea for Rystar originated from, and because of that, the rabbit character of Sonic has gotten a lot of traction in the Sonic community and still does kind of live on. The community has dubbed this rabbit character Feels the Rabbit, as the original prototype name for the game Rystar was originally Feel. And so, as the character that turned into Rystar, or at the very least potentially inspired Rystar, it seems fairly appropriate, and actually Feels has gone on to, in some method, recently appear in the Sonic the Hedgehog IDW comic series in the form of a Hatsune Miku parody called Mika. As of now, this character has only ever gotten a small cameo, but the potential for this Mika character for Feels appearing more in official Sonic material does actually exist. So how about that? An early prototype version of Sonic actually getting turned into their own character. I certainly wouldn't expect to see Feels or Mika show up in the main game series or anything, but I appreciate that they are willing to look back at the original ideas of Sonic and take inspiration from the community and what they've done with the character. It's a very similar idea to a lot of things that we saw in Sonic Mania. There are many things from Sonic Mania that were taken from old scrapped ideas from old Sonic games that were never done anything with. They took those for Mania and actually kind of realized them in some form or another. In fact, the pre-order trailer for Sonic Mania also featured a reference to Feels. So yeah, that's a cool little thing, but that's kind of a relatively surface level thing. A lot of people know about that early rabbit design for Sonic, Feels the Rabbit, Mika, whatever you want to call it. Now let's get into something extremely obscure. This is something that I am willing to bet that like 90% of Sonic fans have never heard of in their entire lives. which is the original story concept for Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic's origin. In the game, Sonic's origin story has never been explored before. It has intentionally been left completely blank, and we don't know anything about Sonic's origin or his history. All we know is that he hails from some island in the Sonic universe called Christmas Island, and that's about it. We don't even know anything about Christmas Island. But actually, while developing Sonic 1, the original Sonic team did come up with an origin story for Sonic, and it is something that you would not at all expect. It is completely different than anything that we actually see represented in the Sonic games. The actual games and stories of the Sonic universe are kind of two layers of reality separated from us, because the actual original story concept for Sonic is that Sonic is actually a fictional character inspired by a real-life person. But this real-life person isn't actually real. This is the second layer of fictional reality, the actual fictional universe that wraps around the fictional universe of Sonic. The original origin story for Sonic is that he was created by a woman named Mary Garnet, who is a writer of children's books. And again, keep in mind, this Mary Garnet person isn't actually a real person. This is a different fictional universe separated from our own that wraps around the fictional Sonic universe. Anyway, this Mary character, her husband was a World War II Air Force pilot, and Mary affectionately gave her husband the nickname of Hedgehog as his hair would spike up when he would take off his helmet. And Mary's husband was a pilot that was working on a top-secret military project called Blue Gale, which was endeavoring to create the first plane that could ever break the sound barrier, which is a real thing that happened in the 1940s with the real-life pilot Chuck Yeager. However, there was an additional pilot that was also working on this project that is Mary's husband in this story. Again, none of this is actually real. Anyway, with this Mary Garnet character being a children's author, she eventually ended up creating the character of Sonic the Hedgehog for her husband, the hedgehog that is endeavoring to go faster than the speed of sound, and she created the character of Sonic the Hedgehog to basically be a cartoonified version of her husband, and she decorated the back of his pilot jacket with a picture of Sonic. And Mary would take this character of Sonic the Hedgehog that she created basically just to be a mascot for her husband, and she would use him as the basis of many stories that she would tell to the local kids and her daughter Sherry. And these stories that she told these kids, these are the stories of the Sonic games. And this is already kind of weird enough as the origin for Sonic based on what we know of the character now, but it goes further than that. We're not stopping right here. There is actually more to this. So in real life, Chuck Yeager was the first pilot to ever break the sound barrier in a plane. But on the same day, there was actually an incident prior to that ended up getting lost to time in the records of history, again, all fictional. And in this incident, prior to Chuck's flight, Mary's husband, the Sonic the Hedgehog human character inspiration mascot guy, he was the first one that was attempting to fly a plane that would break the sound barrier. However, during the test, something went wrong and his plane ended up crashing and exploding and he ended up dying. Now we fast forward 40 years in the future where we introduce the character of Meg, who is a freelance photographer that is going to cover an air show. However, prior to the show, she visits an old antique shop and there she sees an old pilot jacket that has the image of Sonic the Hedgehog on the back. And this Meg character actually recognizes Sonic a little bit, and upon talking to the owner of the antique store a little bit, she remembers that she was the neighbor kid to Mary Garnet, the author that created Sonic, and she actually listened to the stories that Mary would tell about Sonic. Elated with nostalgia for rediscovering a character that she used to love as a kid, Meg decides to buy this jacket. And it quickly became a favorite of hers, and she would wear it everywhere. She had this feeling that was, like, very warm and comfortable and safe whenever she would wear this jacket with Sonic on the back. Now we cut to the air show that Meg is supposed to be reporting on, and particularly during an accident that occurs when some old vintage World War II planes are doing their maneuvers, one of the planes ends up crashing onto the ground right near Meg, and she ends up surrounded by the wreckage and debris and fire of the plane. She tries to find a way out, but is unable to escape as the flames are all around her, and eventually the heat starts to get to Meg and she begins to pass out. However, right as she's beginning to pass out, a hand reaches out to Meg and grabs her, and she can't really clearly see what's happening as she's blacking out. All she recognizes is some strange blue form, and a feeling of acceleration is the last thing she recalls before she goes unconscious. Meg later then wakes up in a hospital bed where she's not too badly injured. The nurse explains to her that she was found on a grassy hill miles away from where the airshow was taking place, and no one knew how she got there. Until Meg noticed that the picture of Sonic on the back of her jacket was gone somehow. It's as if Sonic came out of her jacket and entered the real world in order to save Meg's life, but of course that's not possible, that's totally insane. So Meg doesn't explain this to anyone, but she can't help but wonder, is it actually somehow possible that Sonic saved her from that plane wreck? Later, Meg would go on to develop the pictures she took of the air show, and in one of the pictures, she did find a blurry image of large red shoes with white stripes on them. Evidence that maybe Sonic actually did manage to save her somehow. Was that really possible? Was it actually the case that Sonic saved her? Is he out there somewhere? Meg wasn't really sure. She was confused, but she became very excited upon developing this picture as she realized that perhaps one day she might be able to meet Sonic again. And that is the original origin story for Sonic the Hedgehog. Very, very strange. When I first read this, I was like, is this fake? This is like the weirdest thing I've ever heard in my life. But actually, no, this is 100% real. In fact, Hirokazu Yasuhara and Naoto Oshima, two of the original members of Sonic Team, once had a GDC talk where they talked about the process of creating Sonic, and they went into the whole thing of this original story concept. It is an extremely strange thing, but I almost kind of like it in a way. I actually much prefer an origin story like this than some sort of more conventional origin story where Sonic is just some hedgehog that somehow got powers and turned super fast and whatever. Like, we don't need that kind of explicit backstory for Sonic that tells us who he is. That doesn't really add anything to the character. This type of origin for him, though, this kind of preserves some of that mysticism behind Sonic that there is no explanation for why he is the way he just is. The fact that Sonic was, a fictional character within this universe that somehow, almost magically, managed to come into reality and save this person's life. To me, that is a much more appropriate origin story for Sonic and is much more in line with what Sonic is really about, but that's a whole other thing that we can get into at another time. For now, what I would like to say is that what's interesting about this story is that we don't really know if this was a scrapped story concept or not, because there's nothing in this story premise that contradicts what we see in the Sonic games, because the Sonic games are the stories that this Mary character would tell to the local children. And so it's entirely possible that all of the Sonic games that we play, even to this very day, are still within this wrapped larger universe of these being children's stories told by Mary. I mean, I assume this idea was probably scrapped at some point, because if not, then Mary really went off the fucking rails when she got to, like, Shadow the Hedgehog and shit like that. Like, why are you telling children stories like that? What's wrong with you? But jokes aside, yeah, I kind of like the ideas going on here, and what's interesting is we can still see elements of these story details still present in the Sonic games. The emblem on the title screen of most of the classic Sonic games, that is the emblem that Mary created for her husband. That's the thing that would be on his back, on his pilot jacket. The imagery that we see on the Sonic emblem is very common across aviation medals and badges and things like that. Some sort of circular centerpiece with wings coming off of the side. And this whole emblem idea for Sonic and the cartoony character of Sonic, that comes from the idea of old school nose art that pilots would put on their planes back in the day. While most of the time these would be depictions of sexy ladies, some pilots opted to put cartoon characters on the noses of their planes, and so you can easily imagine how Mary's husband probably also would have had nose art on his plane of the Sonic the Hedgehog emblem. You know, it's that idea that Sonic is protecting this guy, protecting this pilot that is Mary's husband, and then that idea turns into Sonic being on Meg's jacket and then saving her life. It all makes sense in terms of what they're going for with that story. In fact, considering Sonic's roots and inspirations in old aviation, it's not at all surprising to me that the Tornado was eventually introduced into the series. Sonic's own plane that he is a pilot of, I'm sure that takes directly from these same inspiration sources. In fact, in the old Sonic manga, the main character Nicky, his father is a pilot, and he has the jacket that has the depiction of the Sonic the Hedgehog emblem on the back. And yeah, those illustrated excerpts that I showed you before, there is also the Sonic the Hedgehog story comic, which is a manga that was released around the same time that Sonic 1 came out in Japan, basically telling the story of Sonic 1, though it was clearly based on earlier versions of the story before it was entirely finalized. And at the end of this manga, it does feature the original Sonic origin story, complete with illustrations. So ain't that all very, very interesting to see the inspirations and the original core concepts that would eventually turn into Sonic the Hedgehog? Even if these ideas of this pilot that kind of turns into Sonic after he dies or something, whatever it is, it's cool to see that even if those ideas were eventually scrapped and are no longer part of Sonic, you can still see how they exist in the Sonic universe in some way. As a creative person myself, I find these kinds of things to be fascinating because this is what happens during the creative process. You have ideas and you like them and you develop them and you continue with them and you get something that really cool is going on, but eventually you're like, maybe let's change things and let's remove some of these ideas. But remnants of those earlier ideas are still present and still there, and if you know that those things exist, you can actually backtrace where things are that still currently are present in the series. A little bit off topic, but to talk more about Sonic's inspirations, another thing about the Sonic emblem that's very iconic to it is that ribbon at the bottom. Now, I can't say exactly for certain where the inspiration from that comes from, but one place that I have seen it from that I know definitely did partially inspire Sonic in numerous ways is in the Studio Ghibli movie Castle in the Sky. You can see a very, very similar looking ribbon with the name at the bottom of this image. And in fact, this image is an in-universe photo taken of Laputa, the floating island in the world of Castle of the Sky that almost certainly was an inspiration for Angel Island. For anyone that's unfamiliar with Castle in the Sky, it is a movie about people searching for this mythical floating island of legend that used to be home to an ancient civilization. Maybe you want to just call this coincidence, but Castle in the Sky also features a character that looks like this. So yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that Sonic Team was looking at Miyazaki works for inspiration. In fact, if you look at a couple of other early Miyazaki things, you can see many, many elements that are very reminiscent of Sonic the Hedgehog, now aren't they? Anyway, that's enough of that. This is not supposed to be a video about the inspirations of Sonic the Hedgehog. Let's get back to talking about scrapped ideas. And of course, when talking about scrapped Sonic ideas for Sonic 1, we have to talk about Madonna, the original concept for a human girlfriend character for Sonic the Hedgehog, which I don't really think is a problematic thing at all. It's the exact same thing as Roger Rabbit. We have a cartoon animal character that has a girlfriend that is a cartoon human character. I mean, I already don't give a fuck about the whole quote-unquote bestiality crap because it's all cartoon characters. It really doesn't fucking matter. But eventually, Sonic Team decided to scrap the concept of Madonna as it was decided that it might not exactly be appropriate for what they were going for. And personally, looking at Madonna and her design, I have to wonder if she too was also partially inspired by old school aviation with the nose art and how they would often depict pretty ladies. She kind of has a similar style going on to her in her design. And another fun fact about Madonna is that in the Archie Sonic comics, eventually a character called Madonna did appear who was a gun agent. And even more interestingly, this character's full name was Madonna Garnet, so not just taking inspiration from Madonna, but also taking inspiration from Mary, the character from the original Sonic story concepts. Now that is a really deep-cut reference right there. Of course, another commonly known thing from Sonic 1's early days is Sonic's band. Originally, Sonic was envisioned as being the singer of a band. The idea here is that this was going to be for the sound test mode of the game, and these characters, Sonic's band members, over the course of Sonic 1, you would be saving each one of them as you completed the game, but that eventually had to get cut. And all of these band members do actually have names. We have Sharps the Parakeet, we have Mock the Rabbit, Max the Monkey, and Vector the Crocodile, who of course Vector did eventually end up getting realized as the character that we know today. Again, this is something where we can see remnants of Vector's original idea still present in his current iteration, as he still has the headphones and is a music lover today because originally he was the keyboardist of Sonic's band. And remember before how I talked about the Sonic the Hedgehog story comic, that manga based on the early ideas of Sonic 1? In one of the pages of this comic, we can see Sonic performing in his band. This band was also featured in a 1992 Sonic calendar, where we can see them hanging out with Sonic, and of course they did also eventually appear in a small cameo in the Archie Sonic comics. But also, in the 8-bit version of Sonic 1, when you complete the game and get the end credits, you get this image of Sonic holding a microphone. Definitely a leftover from the ideas of Sonic performing in a band. Again, kind of a neat little thing there, though in this case I actually am kind of glad that this didn't really end up in the Sonic games, because Sonic performing in a band seems very out of character to me, based on what we know of Sonic now. He doesn't seem like the type that would want to, like, go on tours and maintain a schedule and do shows and perform and all that. You know, there's such a rigid structure and so many responsibilities and so many commitments that come with performing in a band, and that just does not match Sonic's free lifestyle. But, you know, I wouldn't be opposed necessarily to seeing the members of the Sonic band return in some other form one day, possibly. They did it for Vector, why not the other characters, I say? That's pretty much it for all of the original Sonic 1 stuff, but there's plenty more to talk about still. Going into Sonic 2, there is one thing in particular that I want to talk about, which is the setting and story concept for Sonic 2 was originally very different than what we ended up finally getting in the end product, because originally Sonic 2 was actually going to be about time travel. You know how Sonic CD is about time travel? That is because Sonic CD began its life as a Sega CD enhanced port of Sonic 2. But during the development of Sonic 2, they eventually decided to scrap that idea, but there are, once again, still remnants of this that we can see left over in the Sonic 2 we have today. I mean, for one, we have Emerald Hill, which is like a carbon copy of Green Hill. Why is that? Is it just because they wanted that to be a recurring motif in Sonic? Well, possibly, but actually that's because originally Sonic 2 also took place on South Island like Sonic 1, and Emerald Hill was originally supposed to once again be Green Hill. We can see that on this early map of Sonic 2. And there are multiple iterations of this map we can see of what the island looks like at different time periods, but also, interestingly, have you ever noticed how Hilltop Zone in Sonic 2 has the exact same tile set as Emerald Hill, just recolored differently? That is because Hilltop was originally supposed to be Green Hill in the past. This is what I was talking about before that I find very interesting. If you're unaware of these things, you wouldn't even notice this. But now that you know that that's the case, you can clearly and easily see how Hilltop is a leftover remnant of an earlier version of Sonic 2. I just find this kind of stuff to be fascinating. I guess it is also worth talking about the game I'm playing right here, SegaSonic Bros. This is an arcade game that never really technically came out, though it kind of did come out. It's a whole thing, but what's interesting about this game is that it features multiple different Sonics of different colors. We got the normal blue one, a yellow one, a red one, and even a white one that you can eventually find if you get further into the game. And, you know, the title of the game is SegaSonic Bros. In the title screen, it shows us multiple Sonics of different colors. Is this just for game purposes? We just have multicolored Sonics to be our multicolored blocks in this block falling game? Or are we actually supposed to take this as Sonic's brothers that are different colors than him? I think you can probably guess the answer on that one. We kind of got a bit of a four swords situation going on here, but, you know, kind of interesting. Now, another interesting one I want to talk about is actually Tails Sky Patrol, because this one has a very neat little unique element to it, which is that originally this wasn't a Sonic game at all. This game was originally made with an entirely different IP separate from Sonic, and later when the game was brought to the Game Gear, Sega decided to give it a Sonic skin in order to probably increase the sales of it. And so that means that the concepts and characters in Tails Sky Patrol were not actually intended for Sonic. The villain of the game, Witchcard, she is technically not really a Sonic character, as she did not begin her life as a Sonic character. And her minions, these three characters here, they also were originally not Sonic characters. The current versions of them that we have now, they are the altered versions made to fit the Sonic universe, but originally, there is some old footage of an earlier version of Tails Sky Patrol where we can see one of these characters looking a lot like Pete from Mickey Mouse. So it's very, very likely that originally Tails Sky Patrol was actually a Disney-themed game before it got reworked into a Sonic game. And I guess while we're also talking about this game and these characters, it's also once again worth mentioning that Witchcard eventually did also appear in the Archie comics along with her three minion characters, who got redesigned to more traditionally match the typical looks of Sonic characters that we see, and they were kind of turned into a trio. As any Sonic fan will know, that trios are kind of a common motif that we see a lot in the Sonic universe. Apparently they also rode X-Treme gear at one point, that's kind of cool. Now, when it comes to talking about scrapped and cancelled Sonic ideas and concepts, we of course need to talk a little bit about Sonic X-Treme. I'm not going to talk too much about the game itself, that's a whole other topic for another time. What I want to focus on here is the story concepts that they were kicking around for Sonic X-Treme while it was still in development, because as this game was never finished, it never did get a locked-in, established story. In fact, there are many, many different stories for what the story of Sonic X-Treme was going to be at different points of its development. I'm not going to talk about every single one of these story concepts, but I will talk about a couple of them that I find particularly interesting. Now, first of all, it's worth mentioning that at one point during the early development of Sonic X-Treme, the game was originally going to have 4 playable characters: Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and a brand new character called Tiara Boobowski. Yes, that was actually going to be this character's name. And this character was envisioned to be Sonic's girlfriend. I guess, fuck you, Amy, though Amy was also originally going to be in this game in some capacity. But interestingly, Sonic X-Treme had an idea where all 4 of these different characters would play in different ways. Sonic would get the 3D platforming with the fisheye lens kind of stuff. Tails would actually get a first-person flight game, Knuckles would get a top-down maze style of gameplay, and Tiara was going to have more traditional 2D style of Sonic gameplay. And I just want to point that out, as I find it very interesting that this concept of a Sonic game where we have multiple different characters with different playstyles eventually did come to fruition in the first proper 3D Sonic game with Sonic Adventure. Did they take this idea from Sonic X-Treme? Probably not, but it's interesting to see the similarities. Anyway, as for Tiara, we don't know too much about her, as she was never even properly finished as a character, but the idea for her was that she was supposed to be Sonic's match. She was supposed to be someone that had very good chemistry with him, so presumably she probably also had a similar free-spirited attitude to him, though potentially not, as Sonic X-Treme was created by an American development team which was going off of the American version of the Sonic lore, where Sonic was characterized very differently, so who can really say what the hell Tiara's characterization would have been? As far as her role in the story goes, in one of the early concepts for Sonic X-Treme, the idea was simply that Sonic was going to go on a date with Tiara, and she lived very far away, and the game is simply his journey of trying to get to her to meet her up for their date, and Robotnik sees Sonic trying to get to her and sets up a bunch of traps and tries to take this opportunity to take out Sonic. That's one of the early concepts and ideas, but another one was that Tiara's father, Gazebo Bubowski, was going to create a cure for a disease that Robotnik infected Sonic with. The idea was that you would go to all the different zones of the game and collect ingredients in order to create this cure, and it would eventually result in Sonic and Tiara defeating Robotnik to get the final ingredient, thus curing Sonic and saving his life. Another very interesting concept for Sonic X-Treme story was one about this idea of Chaos Doom, which was something that was apparently trapped inside the Master Emerald, and Robotnik breaks the Master Emerald, and this releases this Chaos Doom entity. We're not even exactly sure what it is. It's not necessarily described as a being. It's kind of almost like maybe it could be a force or an energy or something. It is described as being intelligent in some kind of way, so whatever it is, this Chaos Doom being would infect the world around it and kind of start to ruin and kill things, and it was going after Sonic as it was the one thing that could potentially pose a threat to Chaos Doom, and naturally Sonic ends up defeating this. Interesting how this story has that same concept again as Sonic Adventure, with some sort of bad entity trapped inside the Master Emerald, and Eggman smashing it open to release this thing. Once again, I don't necessarily think that this was what was the inspiration for Sonic Adventure, but it's interesting to see the similarities and the common ideas coming from different teams at similar times. Another thing that's interesting about this particular story is that Tiara is nowhere mentioned at any point in it, and that is because eventually, because the development of Sonic X-Treme was going very, very poorly, they decided at some point to cut Tiara out of the game, as they had to focus on just making a video game instead. So they cut the ideas of Tails, Knuckles, and Tiara's alternate gameplay, and were just trying to focus on the Sonic gameplay. And at some point very late into Sonic X-Treme's development, Hirokazu Yasuhara, the lead designer of Sonic's 1, 2, and 3, he came aboard to help out with Sonic X-Treme, and interestingly, the final story that we know of for Sonic X-Treme seems much more in line with the original Japanese continuity with Sonic, which makes me wonder if potentially Yasuhara helped contribute to this last draft of the story that we have. In this version of the story, first of all, it explicitly states that this takes place after the events of Sonic 3 and Knuckles, where Eggman has returned with a brand new Death Egg that he's created that is even larger than the entire planet. It is actually so large that it has managed to rip multiple planets out of their normal orbits and has caused them to start orbiting around the Death Egg. And Eggman is bringing this new Death Egg to Earth in order to get the Earth to start orbiting around it as well. Sonic, of course, plans to stop Robotnik, as this is still an American-written story, and Tails creates a teleporter that is going to send Sonic to the Death Egg, which was going to serve as why Tails would not be present and playable in Sonic X-Treme. He is busy operating the teleporter, and also Knuckles is not present as there was no time to contact him for help in this situation. Look at that, continuity, actually giving us an explanation and reason for why the previously playable characters would not be playable in what technically would be the sequel to Sonic 3 and Knuckles at this point. So anyway, Tails would teleport Sonic to the Death Egg, but Robotnik, foreseeing this, would somehow have all of the planets get in a line with Sonic's teleportation beam, so they would intercept him and he would not reach the Death Egg. Instead, he would end up on the farthest planet from the Death Egg, and he would have to work his way from planet to planet, where Eggman has taken the inhabitants of the planet called MIPS, which are some alien creatures native to these planets that we don't really have any familiarity with. Like the animals on Earth, Eggman would use these things to power his robots, and thus he had set up a ton of traps on all these different planets that he hoped would be enough to defeat Sonic as he attempted to make his way to the Death Egg. We don't know very much about these MIPS, as again, this game was not finished, but here's an illustration of some concept ideas for what they potentially would have looked like. And yeah, those are the story concepts of Sonic X-Treme. I certainly do kind of like that last one there. I think that one has some potential. A little bit strange that we're escalating so extremely to the point of Eggman being able to create a Death Egg even larger than the Earth itself. But, you know, that's really just a justification for kind of the weird geometry of Sonic X-Treme's levels, that the idea that these are all planets orbiting around in space. This is definitely an instance of the story kind of being made to wrap around the game, which came first, rather than kind of the game and story both being developed together. As far as Tiara goes, honestly, I'm not really crying that she ended up not really becoming a thing, as, you know, as a creation for the American version of the Sonic lore, I have to wonder how she would even be incorporated into the Japanese Sonic stories going forward. Like, would they just completely ignore this character? Or would they somehow try to find a way to incorporate her into the Japanese canon in a way that works? I've already talked about how I don't really find it appropriate for Sonic to get into a romantic relationship, so the idea of him having a girlfriend definitely is not something that I really think is right for the Sonic series, so Tiara's absence is honestly perfectly fine by me. I guess one last thing for Sonic X-Treme is here's a bunch of concept art for a bunch of Metal Sonic designs that they were kicking around, and a lot of these look pretty cool. I mean, some of them look kind of weird, and some of them don't look anything like Sonic, but some of them I kind of like these designs. Oh yeah, and I guess one last thing that is potentially worth mentioning is that both Metal Sonic and Fang were going to be featured in this game as bosses, which, if this was going to be the next mainline Sonic game, then this would actually be Fang's first appearance in, like, a main, proper Sonic game, if you don't really count the 8-bit Sonic games. The next game I want to talk about, of course, is Sonic Adventure, though there's not really that much to talk about in terms of, like, cut story ideas that we're aware of that didn't end up into the game. What actually is more worth talking about is how Sonic Adventure story ended up coming to be in the fashion that it is. Many people are aware that Sonic Adventure originally began its life as a Sega Saturn game, and the remnants of that version of Sonic Adventure can be seen in the Sonic world found in Sonic Jam. This is taking what they had left over of those early prototypes and reworking it into this kind of little fun thing here. And there have been some concept renders that have been released of what the Saturn iteration of Sonic Adventure may have potentially looked like, kind of what they were going for. And can I just say, I think these look so fucking good. Oh my god, I wish we had gotten this game, but oh well, whatever, it is what it is. Anyway, as we all know, the game eventually restarted its development on Dreamcast, and eventually got its art style change as well. But one interesting thing about the art style change of Sonic Adventure is that it came relatively late into development. We have seen more concept renders of the Dreamcast version of Sonic Adventure where we can see that he still had his classic design, and there are many remnants of the classic Sonic model still in the final game of Sonic Adventure. One of the biggest and most prominent artifacts still left in the game is that in the original Dreamcast version, when you're doing the Sky Chase levels, you can very clearly and easily see that Sonic and Tails are using their Saturn models here. And another interesting leftover in Sonic Adventure that we can see from earlier versions of it is that at one point, probably when the game was on Saturn, Sonic Adventure was going to be an RPG. I imagine because they realized pretty quickly that doing a 3D platformer on the Saturn was probably not going to be possible, so they instead decided to do a Sonic RPG on the Saturn, but once restarting development on Dreamcast, they now had a machine powerful enough to do a proper 3D platformer, but I suspect that they still liked the story concepts and ideas that they had for the Saturn RPG version of Sonic Adventure, and they decided to keep a lot of those in the final game. I assume this is why we have the hub worlds in Sonic Adventure, as they are leftovers from the idea of having towns and stuff that you would walk around in the RPG version where you can talk to NPCs and stuff. That is also, of course, why the game is so much radically more story-heavy than any of the previous Sonic games, and I suspect that is even why the Sonic Adventure cutscenes are so bad, as the cutscenes are done entirely with the normal game engine, just using in-game animations and simple moving the characters around, very similarly to how old-school, like, SNES RPGs would do it with sprite art, where they would just move the characters around and use simple sprite animations to try to convey the story. Again, I find this stuff fascinating that we can see leftovers of previous versions of the game, and through that we can kind of reverse engineer the creative process and see how these things ended up in the final game and what the thought process of the development was like. Of course, this is all guesswork, we don't exactly know what happened, but there is evidence that says that this is probably likely the kinds of ideas that we saw. And actually, what's interesting about the cutscenes of Sonic Adventure is that they're not very good, we all know that, but there have actually been storyboards released of the first cutscene of the game where we can see that there actually was very different plans that they probably were not able to achieve with this very primitive animation system in Sonic Adventure. Looking at these storyboards, we can for one see that they're still using the classic Sonic design, as that was what the game was originally going to have, but we can also see entirely different cinematography, directing, and we can see like actual pacing and stuff that I think, if it managed to get into the final game, would have been far more effective than the clunky and awkward cutscenes that we got in the final product. If they ever do finally make a Sonic Adventure remake, I would love to see these storyboard cutscenes brought to life in the way they originally were supposed to be, because I'm sure they have plenty more of these for all the cutscenes in the game, and they're probably much better than what we ended up getting. Another quick interesting thing about the story of Sonic Adventure is Chaos itself, as Chaos being a water creature was actually something that must have arisen during the game's development on Dreamcast and not its original development, as part of the idea for Chaos and making him a water creature was so that way he would be transparent, to show off that the Dreamcast was capable of doing transparencies, as that was something that Sega consoles previously were not really able to do or that they struggled with. So with the Dreamcast, they decided to make the main enemy of the game transparent for the technological showcase, which would mean that during the Saturn era of Sonic Adventure's development, Chaos was probably something completely different. What that was, we have no idea, but again, very interesting thing to think about. And one last thing I want to talk about Sonic Adventure is once again not a cut or scrap thing in it, but it is kind of just an interesting little tidbit in the game, which is this robot Sonic model here that is found in Eggman's base. What's interesting about this robot Sonic is that this specific design has never been featured anywhere else in the entire Sonic game series. This robot doesn't even have a name. A lot of Sonic fans refer to this as Mecha Sonic or Mecha Sonic version 3, as he bears some similarities to the Mecha Sonic found in Sonic 2. And a lot of Sonic fans like to speculate what this robot is, or maybe in earlier versions of the game you would fight this as a boss or whatever. Personally, I find this very unlikely. I think that this robot was strictly created just to be set decoration for the background of Eggman's base. I don't really think that much thought was put into what this is supposed to be. It's just supposed to be a cool Sonic robot to be a background element, and it definitely succeeded at that because this is a pretty cool looking Sonic robot design, so much so that myself and many Sonic fans wish that someday Sonic Team would do something with this robot design. And it is also worth mentioning that this Sonic design did eventually show up in the Archie Sonic comics, and also you can see very many similarities to this robot's design in Mecha Knuckles featured in Sonic Advance. So maybe potentially they took this idea of this robot Sonic and kind of adapted it to fit Mecha Knuckles in that game. And as far as the look and general design of the robot, it is actually inspired by Mecha Godzilla. If you compare this design to Mecha Godzilla, you can see multiple similarities in terms of how they look. One in particular that really stands out is the eyes, how this robot Sonic has these like grid-like eyes, and in many versions of Mechagodzilla we can see very similar things. So this robot is really supposed to be a Mechagodzilla reference, which is pretty cool. And actually, going off of that, I have my own proposition for the community of what we should call this robot Sonic design, as it doesn't really have a proper one, and referring it to Mecha Sonic, some kind of variation of that, isn't really appropriate if you ask me. You could say that we should call this thing Mecha Sonic, as it is inspired by Mechagodzilla, but in Japanese, Mechagodzilla is not called that. In Japanese, it is referred to as Kiryu, which is a portmanteau of two Japanese words. Ryu means dragon, and Ki comes from Kikai, which means machine. And so Mechagodzilla, Kiryu, his actual term is Machine Dragon, or you could also say that as Machine Godzilla, because, you know, Godzilla's basically a dragon. And so with Machine Godzilla, this robot Sonic being inspired by that, I propose that we refer to this Sonic robot as Machine Sonic. Now, moving from Sonic Adventure 1 to 2, there's only really one big thing to talk about here, which is the early development versions of Shadow. If we look at early concept art of Shadow, we see that he looked a lot more like Sonic in his earliest designs. And I imagine this is because Shadow's inception as a character was to be an evil version of Sonic. And so their starting point was what an evil Sonic might look like until they eventually evolved that into the Shadow we know today. And once again, we can see remnants of this idea of evil Sonic being present in Sonic Adventure 2, as that is the most logical and realistic explanation for why so many people mistake Shadow for Sonic, and why Sonic and Shadow themselves describe themselves as looking identical to each other, even though in the final game they don't really look super similar. That is because the story of Sonic Adventure 2 was written under the assumption that Sonic and Shadow would look very, very alike. And actually, originally Shadow was going under a different name. Previously, his name was going to be Terios, which means reflection. And similar to Feels the Rabbit, the Sonic community has really latched on to this idea of Terios, and really wishing we could have seen what this cut Sonic character would have been like, what Terios would have been like as a character. And this is where I feel like a lot of people don't really understand the creative process and what Terios actually is, because Terios did end up in Sonic Adventure 2 as Shadow. Terios is Shadow. They are the same character. They are not two different characters. Terios is simply an earlier iteration and an earlier version of what Shadow would become. Most likely, in terms of his character story and characterization, Terios probably was exactly identical to Shadow, he just looked different and had a different name. We can even see in later iterations of Terios, as he's getting closer and closer to looking like Shadow, eventually he starts to incorporate the rocket shoes into his design. This is just how things work. Terios is not a different cut Lost Sonic character, he's Shadow. That said, nowadays, taking this earlier concept version of the character and turning it into his own character, similar to what we did with the early Rabbit version of Sonic and turning that into Feels/Mika, I definitely think that you could kind of come up with a cool characterization for Terios that could make him a potentially neat character. For example, the idea of him being an earlier iteration of Shadow, we could incorporate that into his character, say that he is the in-between version created by Professor Gerald, in between the Bio-Lizard and Shadow. In the middle there we had Terios, another attempt to recreate Sonic. But you could say that Terios was made without any Black Arms DNA, which is why he doesn't have any of the features of Black Arms, and why he isn't quite the ultimate life form. He's a failed prototype. You know, you could go with something like that for his character, and that would be both cool and referential to what this character originally was, and actually appropriate and fitting in a way that could potentially create for cool story opportunities. And while we're talking about Sonic Adventure 2 and earlier versions of characters, here are some early concept ideas for Rouge, who originally her name was going to be Nails, as she was supposed to be Knuckles' rival character, and so, you know, Knuckles, Nails, all makes sense there, but that eventually got turned into Rouge for the final version. Now, as far as scrapped ideas for Sonic Heroes, there is definitely something going on here that's cool and worth talking about, which is that originally, the game was going to feature even more playable characters and many rearranged teams. Originally, the team compositions were something along the lines of this. We had Team Sonic being Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, but then Team Rose was actually comprised of Amy, Cream, and Rouge. There was also going to be a team that was Chaos, Gamma, and Big, the three new characters introduced in Sonic Adventure. And then we have Team Chaotix with Espio, Charmy, and Vector, but then we also had Fang, Bean, and Bark from Sonic the Fighters. They were originally going to be a trio, and then lastly there was going to be a team of Metal Sonic, Ray, and Mighty. And there are many interesting implications about these team compositions that we can talk about. For one, you'll notice that Shadow was absent from that lineup, as originally Shadow was intended to be a one-off character that was never going to come back, and they were originally going to go with that for Sonic Heroes, but once they decided to bring Shadow back, things changed. For one, I imagine that's why Gamma was turned into Omega, as they decided that it probably wouldn't be a good idea to bring back two dead characters at the same time. Also, they had to cut some teams just for development purposes, because making 18 playable characters is a lot and was not realistically achievable, and that is probably why Espio, Charmy, and Vector, as members of Team Chaotix from Knuckles Chaotix, why they exist in the modern Sonic universe, but Mighty does not, despite also being present in Knuckles Chaotix, because he was originally on a team that got cut from the final game. And of course, Metal Sonic was also going to be a playable character in the game, which means that he was not going to be the original ultimate villain of the game, so most likely Eggman probably was going to be the main villain once again? Not exactly sure, who can say? And an interesting thing about Fang, Bean, and Bark and them being a trio is that eventually in the Sonic comics, both Archie and IDW, these three were turned into a team, and for a while in Archie they were referred to as Team Hooligan. And that's kind of neat to bring back that concept that was originally going to be in Sonic Heroes, though personally I don't really necessarily think it's appropriate for their characters, but that's something that I've already talked about before. The Sonic Adventure team of Chaos, Gamma, and Big is a very bizarre one, because I have no idea how on earth. First of all, how are you going to bring back Gamma? Because Gamma's not just the robot, it's also the bird inside the robot, so that would mean that that bird got turned into a robot again, which is kind of shitty for that bird's story, and it also means it was put into the exact same robot that it was put into before, which is quite the coincidence. I mean, I guess you could make up some sort of story justification that maybe it chose to go back into the Gamma robot for some kind of reason or whatever. But also, how the fuck would you justify Chaos, Gamma, and Big working together? That's such a random team that has, like, no correlation to each other. I really wonder what the idea was supposed to be there. And the last thing I want to talk about is that earlier version of Team Rose with Amy, Cream, and Rouge, because there's something very interesting about that team. While Cream originally appeared in Sonic Advance 2, she was actually created for Sonic Heroes, and then she was put in Sonic Advance 2 to introduce the character before she showed up in Sonic Heroes. And with that, it makes me wonder if at some point during development, Cream was supposed to be a romantic interest for Tails in the same way Amy is to Sonic and Knuckles is to Rouge. I could definitely see that, like, you could have one of the characters have an innocent, childish crush on the other one, and that could potentially work. The fact that we have, like, kind of female counterparts of the male main trio all together kind of implies that maybe that was supposed to be the case. Who really knows? And one last quick thing while we're talking about Sonic Heroes is that at some point earlier in development, Rouge's outfit was going to be black and red, which, you know, that's kind of cool. While we're talking about character design changes over development, another quick one I want to mention is Blaze and her progression during the development of Sonic Rush. I haven't talked too much about just character concepts and evolutions of how they were created because that's not really that interesting to me in most cases. You know, again, that's just the creative process of figuring out what this character is going to be. But particularly, there is something interesting that I find about Blaze as we look at her various versions over time, which is that you can definitely see some Middle Eastern influence in some earlier iterations of Blaze's character, and those managed to stay on her final version with that little jewel that she has on her forehead. That is a common thing that you see in certain Middle Eastern cultures. And it makes me wonder that maybe the Soul Dimension, if we got to see more of it and we got to see Blaze's kingdom proper, I would think that it should maybe have a bit of Middle Eastern influence in how it looks and what the culture is like. That could be pretty cool. Another one I want to talk about real quick is Sonic Rivals, as I actually have a little bit of a theory about this game. Because this game features Eggman Nega as the villain, who was retconned in this game to, instead of being from the Soul Dimension, he was now turned into Eggman's descendant from the future, which contradicts the original iteration of his character as created for Sonic Rush. But I wonder if that's because originally this was not going to be Eggman Nega. Some Sonic Rivals concept art reveals some art for some human-looking characters that appear nowhere in the final game. But particularly this one on the right, this kind of slender scientist man, he kind of reaffirms a theory that I already had, that maybe Eggman Nega was actually a last-minute change from what Sonic Rivals was originally going to have. Maybe originally the game did feature a character that was Eggman's descendant from the future, and at the last minute they decided to turn that into Eggman Nega, as maybe they didn't want to introduce a new character in such an inconsequential spin-off like Sonic Rivals. The particular thing that made me think this is the way that they talk about Eggman Nega, particularly the way Silver and Eggman talk with each other about Eggman Nega. They say things that are very strange that seem like they don't really notice that Eggman Nega as a name is basically just Eggman with a suffix. Silver will be like, Eggman, have you seen someone named Eggman Nega anywhere? And Eggman responds with like, what? Eggman Nega? I've never heard of someone like this before. Who are you talking about? It's as if they don't notice the name Eggman being said in that name, as if earlier in the script, that wasn't actually the name that was being said there, and they just didn't adjust things when they changed this to Eggman Nega. Again, this is just my own theory, but it seems fairly plausible given the evidence. And now we come on to the final thing I want to talk about, which is Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric, and this game's development is a whole giant thing that I'm not going to get into, but particularly the story elements of Sonic Boom are very, very interesting because this game originally had nothing to do with Sonic Boom the cartoon show. This game originally began its development independently of the Sonic Boom cartoon as just a new reboot of the Sonic universe that would be developed in parallel with the current Sonic universe that we still have today. Apparently, originally, the concepts for this story was that it was going to be that it was the origin of Sonic in this new continuity, where Sonic and Eggman actually were friends when Eggman was younger, but due to some incident that occurred involving time travel, they turned into enemies, and this game's story was originally going to have a lot to do with, like, ancients and stuff, which is why there are a lot of ancient ruins depicting echidnas and hedgehogs and some kind of prophecy and stuff like that in Sonic Boom that ultimately doesn't really go anywhere. It is leftovers from when the game had nothing to do with the Sonic Boom cartoon show. Once the Sonic Boom show got going, Sega decided to retrofit this new Sonic continuity to now match the continuity of Sonic Boom, and so it was completely transformed into something entirely different than what it was originally supposed to be. Not much is known about what this Sonic reboot was going to be like, but it was supposed to be a very Americanized version of Sonic, kind of like a Jak and Daxter equivalent, but for the Sonic universe, which remnants of that can definitely still be felt in the final product of Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric. And you can also feel how that has absolutely nothing to do with the actual Sonic Boom cartoon show. And there you have it. There is all of the scrapped story concepts and characters and ideas that I wanted to talk about that were left on the table in the Sonic series. Pretty interesting stuff. I wouldn't mind seeing some of these ideas crop up in new forms in the future, or be referenced in some way, or revived, or brought back, or, you know, whatever. There are some ideas here that had potential, and we could now take these old ideas, just like Sonic Mania, and do new things with them. That could potentially be cool, but that's enough rambling for me. This video is long enough. Thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.